Hi, you're on the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. Do you remember? I've got a message for a special group. If you've been born between the years of 1930 to 1946, you would be somewhere between 75 and 90 years of age. And if you're not, maybe you know somebody who is, and they're still here. Maybe your parents. But if you were born between 1930 and 1946, you share a cultural value. You are the smallest group of children born since the early 1900s. Think about a depression. Think about a world war. You're also the last generation climbing out of the depression who can remember the winds of war and the impact of a world at war that rattled the structure of our daily lives for several years. You are the last ones to remember ration books for everything from gas to sugar to shoes to stoves. You saved tin foil, poured vat into tin cans. You saw cars up on blocks because tires were no longer available. You can remember milk being delivered to your house early in the morning and placed in the milk box on the porch. Oh, ice as well, not on the porch. You were the last to see the gold stars in front of windows of grieving neighbors whose sons died in the war. You saw the boys home from war build their little houses. Sears Roebuck sold these houses. You're the last generation who spent childhood without a television. Instead, you imagined what you heard on the radio. With no television until the 1950s, for the most part, you spent your childhood playing outside. You were told when you got up in the morning after breakfast, go out, and you went out. And oftentimes, as you got older, you wouldn't come home till supper. And nobody ever said, where were you? What have you been doing? No, there was no Little League. There was no city playground for children, for the most part. The lack of television in your early years meant that you had little real understanding of what was going on in the world, what the world was like. On Saturday afternoons, the movies gave you newsreels sandwiched in between westerns and cartoons. In my youth, in the summer, the movie house would run something called 20 cartoons. And you would pay your money and you go watch 20 cartoons. Very frustrating because there were a couple in there they duplicated. And you knew it. Telephones were one to a house. Early on, you shared that with a party line. You had to pick up the phone and see if anybody was there before you started talking. If you heard somebody talking, you were supposed to hang up. If you did not hang up, somebody who was talking would holler at you and tell you to hang up. Boom. And the phone probably hung on a wall in the kitchen. Nobody cared about privacy. In our house, it was right out in the living room. In the area we used for the dining room, the living room was kind of long and thin. And if you were on the phone, everybody knew what you were talking about, probably knew who you were talking to. Computers in those days were called calculators. They were hand cranked. You put your money in, boom, 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 boom. Typewriters were driven by pounding fingers, throwing the carriage and changing the ribbon. The words internet, Google, didn't exist. Newspapers and magazines were written for adults, and the news was broadcast on your radio in the evening. As you grew up, the country was exploding with growth. The government gave returning veterans the means to get an education and spurred colleges to grow. Loans fanned a housing boom. Pent-up demand coupled with new installment payment plans opened many factories for work. New highways would bring jobs and mobility. The veterans joined civic clubs and became active in politics. The radio network expanded from 3 stations to literally thousands. Your parents were suddenly free from the confines of depression and the war, and they threw themselves into exploring opportunities they'd never imagined. You weren't neglected, but you weren't today's all-consuming family focus either. They were glad you played by yourself until the streetlights came on. They were busy discovering the post-war world. You entered a world of overflowing plenty and opportunity, a world where you were welcomed, enjoyed yourself, and felt secure in your future, although depression, poverty was deeply remembered. Polio was the crippler, not corona. You came of age in the 50s and 60s. You are the last generation to experience an interlude where there were no threats to our homeland. The Second World War was over, and the Cold War, terrorism, global warming, perpetual economic insecurity had yet to haunt life with the unease that it brings. Only your generation can remember both a time of great war and a time when our world was secure and full of bright promise and plenty. You grew up at the best possible time, a time when the world was getting better. You are now the last ones, and more than 99% of you are either retired or deceased, and you feel privileged to have lived in the best of times. As one who was born in 1943, I can say, Amen. What was your favorite fast food when you were growing up? We didn't have fast food when I was growing up, I told him. All the food was slow. Now, come on, seriously. Where did you go to eat? Well, as I recall, it was a place called home. Mom cooked every day, and when Dad got home from work, we sat down together at the dining room table or the kitchen table, and if I didn't like what she put on my plate, I was allowed to sit there until I did like it. By this time, the kid was laughing so hard I was afraid he was going to suffer serious internal damage, so I did tell him the part about how I had to have permission to leave the table. Here are some other things I would have told him about my childhood if I thought his system could have handled it. You see, some parents never owned their own house. They never wore Levi's. They never set foot on a golf course. They never traveled out of the country or had a credit card. My parents drove me to school. I had a bicycle that weighed probably 50 pounds and only had one speed, slow. We didn't have television in our house until I was 10 years old. It was, of course, black and white, and the station went off the air at 11 after playing the national anthem and a poem about God. It came back on the air about 6 a.m. Now, I'm talking about me. I didn't have television until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Howdy doody time. And I do think it went off at 10 o'clock. And we had Douglas Edwards in the news for 15 minutes on Channel 10, CBS. We had 15 minutes of John Cameron Swayze and the news on NBC. In our house, that was Channel 3. And of course, it was black and white. There was usually a locally produced news and farm show featuring local people. Of course, I never had a telephone in my room. The only phone we had was on a party line. Before you could dial, you had to listen, make sure somebody wasn't already talking. Pizzas were not delivered to our house, but milk was, and so was bread and ice. All newspapers were delivered by boys, and all boys delivered newspapers. My brother delivered a newspaper 6 days a week. That's the guy writing this article. In my house, I was the brother that delivered the newspapers 6 days a week, 5 o'clock on Sunday morning. More stars kissed with their mouths shut. At least they did in the movies. And there were no movie ratings, because all movies were responsibly produced for everyone to enjoy viewing, without profanity, without violence, or almost anything that would be offensive. If you grew up in a generation before there was fast food, you may want to share some of these memories with your children or your grandchildren. Just don't blame me if they bust out laughing. Growing up isn't what it used to be. Here's some more memories. The author says, my dad is cleaning out my grandmother's house. She died in December. And he brought me an old Royal Crown Cola bottle. Anybody remember Royal Crown Cola? In the bottle top was a stopper with a bunch of holes in it. And I knew immediately what that was. But my daughter had no idea. She thought they had tried to make it a salt shaker or something. What do you think it was? It was the container that held the water you shook out to sprinkle clothes when you were ironing. We didn't have steam irons. You remember headlight dimmer switches on the floor of the car? Ignition switches on the dashboard? Push a button. Pant leg clips for bicycles without chain guards. Soldering irons you heat on a gas burner. Using hand signals for cars without turn signals. Here's an older than dirt quiz. Count all the ones you remember, not the ones you were told about. You'll be rated at the end. Do you remember candy cigarettes? Do you remember coffee shops with tableside jukeboxes? Home milk delivery in glass bottles. Party lines on the telephones. Oh, and the milk had cream on the top. You took that off. Newsreels before the movie began. TV test patterns that came on at night after the last show and were there until television started again in the morning. And there were only 2, maybe 3 channels in your neighborhood, maybe only 1. And that's if you had a television. Do you remember pea shooters? Howdy Doody? 45 RPM records? 78 RPM records? How about 33 1/3? Hi-fi. Metal ice trays with levers, and it's all you could do to get the first one to pop to go, and it was a mess. How about blue flash bulbs? That was for taking pictures. Cork pop guns. Anybody remember Studebakers? You never knew if they were coming or going. At least the last few years they made them. And wash tub ringers. Get the clothes out, put them through a wringer. Remember that? If you remembered at least 3 of these, you're still a baby. If you remembered 3 or 6 of them, you're getting older. How about if you remembered them all? I remember them all. There'll be things you'll talk about later on that your kids didn't remember. And they'll laugh at it just the way you laugh at mine.